around him. And it's not that he was throwing fits and kicking over C-stands and throwing boxes or anything.
And so I'm living that dream, and it's wonderful.
Every day, I share another story from the Golden Age and the moments that shaped an unforgettable era. If you'd like to keep these memories alive with me, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it means a lot. Thank you for being here. Now let's begin. Ron Howard has always been the calm eye in a wild storm, a filmmaker known for dignity, restraint, and treating people right. But the moment he was asked about the darker secrets of the industry that raised him, everything in his face shifted. He once said quietly that people wouldn't believe what some legends became once the cameras turned off, and that the so-called golden age of Hollywood wasn't golden at all. According to him, it was a world built on silence, pressure, and people getting pushed around. A place where fame acted like a shield, letting certain stars behave however they wanted. The same people who shaped America's fantasies were also responsible for breaking spirits behind closed doors. And now, all these years later, Ron Howard is finally willing to repeat the names tied to that chaos. Errol Flynn, the devil behind the smile. Long before smooth-talking spies or rum-drinking pirates hit the screen, there was Errol Flynn, the charming daredevil who made danger look cool. On screen, he was the perfect adventurer, fearless and sharp. Off-screen, Howard explains, he was a whole different story, someone reckless, impulsive, and driven by ego. Born in Tasmania in 1909, Flynn hit Hollywood in the 1930s and shot to fame overnight after Captain Blood in 1935. Studios built a fortune around his charm, but underneath that shine was a man battling personal chaos and serious addiction. By the early 1940s, everything around him was turning toxic. In 1942, he faced charges connected to two young women, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen. Newspapers everywhere ran the story, splitting the entire country. Flynn laughed through the testimony, brushing it off as if being a star made him immune to consequences. Warner Brothers brought in high-level attorneys, fans camped outside the courthouse, and insiders whispered that some witnesses suddenly disappeared after being pressured by powerful people. Flynn was acquitted, but the shadows around him only grew darker. Decades later, private letters from 1978 showed him bragging about his behavior and mocking people who said they were afraid of him. Ron Howard said reading about that trial was a major turning point for him. The moment he realized Hollywood could protect people who acted wrong simply because they flashed a smile for the camera. To the public, Flynn stayed a rebellious icon. To insiders, he was a walking warning sign. Years of alcohol, drugs, and financial messes destroyed him, and in 1959, at just 50, he collapsed in Vancouver after pushing his body far past its limits. His autopsy listed heart failure, cirrhosis, and ulcers, but Howard says the real cause was simple. Flynn lived in extremes, taking from everyone and giving nothing back. His story became a symbol of Hollywood's moral breakdown, a reminder that charm can hide cold behavior, and fame can't save anyone forever. Kirk Douglas, the man who couldn't stop fighting. To Ron Howard, Kirk Douglas was the definition of contradiction. On screen, he spoke of justice, courage, and loyalty, but off-screen, people remembered him very differently. Sharp, intimidating, and constantly ready for a fight. Born Izer Danielovich in 1916 to a struggling immigrant family, Douglas clawed his way out of poverty through pure determination. By the time Spartacus turned him into a worldwide legend, he had everything: power, money, and respect. But people who worked with him said he had a temper that could shake a room. Crew members described him as impossible to satisfy, snapping without warning, leaving people nervous and stressed. Actress Deborah Paget once said he didn't just want to lead a scene, he wanted to control everyone standing in it. Ron Howard, who studied Douglas's performances while learning the craft, later said there was a rage under that smile, the kind that slowly eats a person from the inside out. That intense attitude followed Douglas throughout his career. Over the years, many old Hollywood insiders repeated troubling stories about his behavior toward women. Some authors and people connected to the industry have discussed claims tied to the 1950s involving Natalie Wood, referencing her sister Lana's comments in a 2018 memoir. These stories have been debated for years, and because key people are no longer alive to speak for themselves, Howard emphasizes that these kinds of allegations reflect the complicated, messy, and often secretive culture of the era, rather than proven facts. Douglas never faced charges, and the whole situation disappeared under the same wall of silence that protected so many powerful men during that era. Even long after his passing in 2020 at the age of 103, the controversy didn't return as gossip. It came back as professionals finally speaking honestly about old Hollywood's culture. His presence could lift a set or freeze it, leaving people inspired one second and tense the next. Stanley Kubrick, who directed him twice, once said Douglas was the most driven man I've ever met and the hardest to control. Ron Howard later reflected that the real lesson of Douglas's career wasn't about skill or fame. It was about how unchecked power can twist the rules around one person. Douglas carried himself like nothing applied to him, and the industry let it slide. When Douglas accepted an honorary Oscar in 1996, many people watched an older man trying to close out his life with dignity. But Howard saw something different. The final performance of someone who had spent decades staying 2 steps ahead of his own inner battles. Under all that applause was a truth Hollywood never wanted to look at directly. Some of its brightest legends built their careers not just on talent, but on fear, control, and dominance. Faye Dunaway, the queen of cruelty. If Errol Flynn symbolized corruption and Kirk Douglas represented explosive rage, then Faye Dunaway was a whole different kind of danger. To Ron Howard, she was proof that darkness in Hollywood didn't always show up as violence. Sometimes it showed up as ego, humiliation, and a cold kind of control that could crush a set. Born in 1941 in Bascom, Florida, Dunaway rose fast. Bonnie and Clyde, 1967, Chinatown, 1974, hit after hit. She looked untouchable, almost myth-like with that icy, magnetic presence. But behind that glamorous glow, the industry whispered about her harsh behavior. Crew members talked about tantrums, impossible demands, and the way she treated assistants like they were disposable. Her mommy dearest co-star, Rutanya Alda, once said you could feel the fear on set, like everyone was waiting for an explosion. That film, meant to expose emotional abuse, became, in the eyes of many, a reflection of Dunaway's own behavior. While playing Joan Crawford, a woman often described as cruel, Dunaway reportedly echoed the same cold energy on set. Director Frank Perry later admitted he nearly walked off the project because of her extreme outbursts. She threw objects, tore into makeup artists, and once refused to film until the lighting made her look flawless. Ron Howard would later mention her as an example of what happens when an actor's need for control turns into full-blown emotional domination. And the stories didn't stop. On The Wicked Lady, she was said to have slapped a cameraman. On Don Juan DeMarco, crew members said she embarrassed assistants so badly production shut down for a day. Her former manager Jay Bernstein once said, "Faye doesn't just play divas, she becomes them." By the 2000s, the fallout finally caught up with her. Hollywood stopped calling, and directors avoided her completely, saying she was too difficult to manage. In 2011, after being removed from a Broadway production of Tea at 5, Dunaway blamed everyone but herself. When a journalist asked Ron Howard about her legacy, he answered carefully but sharply. She chased perfection so intensely that she forgot compassion. Her downfall wasn't sudden. It unfolded over years. The woman who once dominated Hollywood found herself isolated and avoided, even at events honoring her own films. To Howard, she became a symbol of what happens when talent has no empathy. He once said, "People talk about power. In Hollywood, power without grace turns to poison." John Wayne, the tyrant of the West. Few Hollywood figures stood as tall as John Wayne. To millions, he was the definition of America, the cowboy, the soldier, the rugged hero who never broke. But to Ron Howard, who grew up watching those classic films on black and white TV, the truth behind that legendary image carried a darker edge. Ron Howard once said that when he learned who John Wayne really was, the hero image snapped instantly. "I stopped seeing the hero. I saw the bully who wore his country like a costume," he reflected, describing how the truth hit him hard. Born Marion Morrison in Iowa in 1907, Wayne climbed through the studio system by selling a fantasy of unbeatable toughness, a brand of masculinity people swallowed whole. By the 1950s, Wayne wasn't just acting, he was promoting an entire worldview. He saw disagreement as weakness and any hint of progress as betrayal. On film sets, he ruled through pressure, never patience. Technicians who didn't meet his expectations got yelled at in front of everybody. Actor Christopher Mitchum once said, "When Duke was angry, the air froze, and according to him, you either stood with Wayne or you were gone." Howard later said that this kind of environment wasn't art at all, it's fear pretending to be discipline. Wayne's behavior didn't stop at shouting matches either. He often belittled women, mocked indigenous performers working on westerns, and dismissed black actors who challenged stereotypical roles on set. His 1971 Playboy interview still shocks people today. He made harsh claims about indigenous land rights and made comments about Black Americans that reflected deep prejudice, while bragging that films needed men, not whiners. These comments resurfaced years later and showed a man stuck in extreme beliefs rather than a patriotic hero. On the set of The Searchers, Wayne clashed hard with director John Ford about how to portray Ethan Edwards. A character written as hateful and vengeful, Ford pushed for a more honest portrayal, but Wayne fought back. In the end, the character's cruelty came through clearly, and so did Wayne's own coldness. Ron Howard, who studied the film years later at USC, said, "It's terrifying because you can't tell where the role ends and the man begins." Even near the end of his life, weakened by cancer, Wayne never backed down from his statements. He brushed off criticism, blamed changing times, and stayed locked in his old worldview until his passing in 1979 at age 72. Many still praised him as an icon, but filmmakers like Howard saw his story as a warning. Power shaped by prejudice doesn't turn wise with age, it turns bitter. Howard once said, "The myth survived, but the man behind it never deserved the legend." Roman Polanski, the exile of shame. For Ron Howard, the name Roman Polanski symbolized one of the hardest truths Hollywood ever tried to avoid. "Brilliance can coexist with evil," he once said, explaining how painful it was to discover the reality behind the filmmaker's image. Howard admitted, "I admired his films before I knew who he really was. Then I realized talent doesn't absolve a person. Sometimes it hides them." Polanski's rise looked unstoppable. Born in Paris in 1933 to Polish parents and surviving the horrors of occupation during World War II, he lived through tragedy long before Hollywood even knew his name. Early films like Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby turned him into a critical darling, a filmmaker who could turn dread into chilling art. But as Howard later said, the darkness in Polanski's movies wasn't just storytelling. It was a reflection of a man hiding storms behind the camera. In 1977, everything changed. Polanski was arrested after a situation involving a young teenager following a photo session. The legal evidence presented was strong enough that he pled guilty to a charge involving unlawful conduct with a minor, a serious admission that carried major weight. But before sentencing could happen, Polanski fled the United States and resettled in France, refusing to return. Hollywood split instantly and violently. Some condemned him completely, while others defended him, calling him a tortured artist, creating a divide that still lingers. For Howard, who was a young filmmaker watching this unfold, the reaction was heartbreaking. "They spoke of art while a child's life was broken," he said years later, pointing to how the industry twisted itself into knots instead of choosing accountability. Polanski's self-imposed exile became one of the most infamous stains on Hollywood's moral record. The case never faded, the controversies only grew, and his absence became a symbol of how the industry struggled, and often failed, to confront the wrongs committed by its own powerful figures. Polanski kept working overseas and even won an Oscar in 2003 for The Pianist, a moment Ron Howard called surreal and stomach-turning. When the crowd at the Dolby Theater rose to applaud, Howard stayed in his seat, frozen. "I thought of that girl alone at 13 and how applause must sound to her ears," he said, unable to understand how the industry kept praising the man so loudly. Even decades later, Hollywood's willingness to separate brilliance from responsibility made him furious. When Polanski won France's César Award in 2020, protesters stormed out of the ceremony, and to Howard that scene felt like justice finally showing up. Late, but not too late. He told Vanity Fair in 2021, "It took the world 40 years to say what should have been said the next day, that a monster doesn't become less monstrous because he can frame a shot." Polanski still lives freely in Europe, protected by legal barriers, but followed everywhere by the controversy attached to his name. For Howard, Polanski's story represents everything that poisoned the so-called Golden Age, a system that protected the artist but ignored the people hurt along the way. "Hollywood forgives anything," he said bitterly, "as long as the lighting is good." Mickey Rooney, the smile that lied. If Polanski showed Hollywood's hypocrisy, Mickey Rooney showed its illusion, the idea that charm could cover up the damage someone caused. For Ron Howard, who once watched Rooney's cheerful musicals on late-night TV, learning who he truly was felt like a punch. "He was the face of joy," Howard said once, "but behind that smile was misery. And worse, he spread it." Born Joseph Ewell Jr. in 1920, Rooney became Hollywood's first massive child superstar. By 18, he was the highest-paid actor in America, with MGM building their empire around his grin and energy. But that kind of fame twisted him early, and as he grew up, so did the chaos. He married 8 times, cheated often, gambled away fortunes, and left emotional wreckage behind him. His ex-wife, Ava Gardner, once said he was the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world. Behind closed doors, the trouble only grew. In 2011, accusations surfaced involving his 8th wife, Jan Chamberlain, and her son, both accused of isolating Rooney and taking control of his finances. But long before these issues, stories of Rooney's own harsh behavior were already legendary. Former co-workers described him as unpredictable and sharp-tongued. Judy Garland, his closest friend during the MGM years, once said privately that he could make you laugh one minute and tear you down the next. Garland, pushed by studio pressure and struggling emotionally, later hinted that Rooney, not just the executives, carried some responsibility for the pain she endured during those early years. By the 1960s, his career was falling apart. Scandals, addiction, and financial disasters followed him everywhere. In a 1979 interview, Rooney said, "I've lived 1,000 lives," but as Howard later reflected, he lived them all for himself. Even in old age, Rooney's anger never seemed to fade. He blamed studios, former partners, friends, even fate itself, for how his life collapsed. When he passed in 2014 at 93, he left behind less than $20,000, and his body initially went unclaimed until friends raised money for a modest burial in Los Angeles. For Ron Howard, Rooney's story was the final piece in a pattern, proof that many of Hollywood's brightest smiles were hiding heavy secrets. "He made the world laugh while he was dying inside," Howard said, calling it the saddest kind of evil, when someone's pain becomes their performance and nobody sees it until it's too late. To Howard, these stories were never about revenge. They were warnings. The Golden Age wasn't golden. It was built on silence, pressure, and hidden lives covered by fame. And as he once said, the scariest monsters aren't in horror films, they're the ones the spotlight protects. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that like button if you felt something real, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories.